Hey you all, my name is Daniel Jordan, and today we'll be going over a lesson on HIV and evolution. So a lot of this information comes from Evolutionary Analysis by Scott C. Herron and John Freeman. The process of evolution is passing down genetic information to offsprings for selective advantage, as we'll see in HIV. So two main things to keep in mind about HIV is that it is a virus and that it cannot replicate on its own. So remember, from an evolutionary perspective, it's very important for an organism to be able to pass genetic information from parent to offspring. But HIV is not able to do this alone, and it is dependent on other organisms to do this. So keep this in mind as we continue to explore HIV and its attack on the human immune system. So next, we're going to look at the function of your immune system. So most people know that the immune system is responsible for keeping infections in check and fighting infections that enter your body. This is the primary function of your immune system, but there are specific cells that help this to happen. So first we have the CD4 helper T cell. These cells are responsible for coordinating the entire immune response, and they actually alarm majority of helper cells or other cells to fight the immune system infection. So these other cells include effector B cells, cytotoxic T cells, and memory B cells. Each of these cells are an important part of fighting infections in your immune system with different functions and responsibilities. But CD4, remember, is the main coordinator for all of these cells and also alarms them to activate their responsibilities in your immune response. So the next step here is HIV cells latch onto CD4 cells and a required co-receptor. And I want you to take note here that CD4 and co-receptor are both required for HIV to latch onto the cell membrane. If both of these components are not available, then HIV cannot attach to the CD4 cell. So I have a couple of questions. Question number 1. What might be some advantages of HIV latching on to the CD4 cells? Remember that CD4 coordinates and alarms most of the immune response to infection. Question 2. Can HIV bind onto the CD4 cell without the co-receptor? Question 3. How do you think HIV hijacks the cell machinery once it latches to the cell? Remember that HIV is a virus and it cannot replicate on its own, so it must use the machinery of the cell to replicate its genetic information. You can pause the video and reflect on these questions before moving forward in the lesson. Okay, so the HIV virion fuses with the host cell membrane and spills its contents into the cell. So this includes a virion genome, a reverse transcriptase, and an integrase. These are the three contents that the HIV virion uses to take over and replicate with the host cell's machinery. All right, so first is the virion genome. Remember that the main point of evolution is to pass genetic information from parent to offspring. So without a genome or virus genetic information, HIV cannot pass this information from parent to offspring. And this is a process that will continue from generation to generation. The genome is RNA strands, and they contain the genetic information of the virus. So keep in mind that HIV has RNA instead of DNA. The next tool is reverse transcriptase. It transcribes virus RNA into DNA. This is because the host cell contains DNA, and in order for the host cell machinery to understand the RNA genetic information, it has to be written in DNA. The last tool used is integrase. It integrates the virus genome, which is now in DNA, into the host cell's genome. It does this so that when the cell machinery is looking for instructions, it takes instructions from the virus DNA, which is now integrated with the host cell's DNA. And the cell machinery is now carrying out the functions of the virus. Thank you for watching the instructional portion of the video. Now we're going to talk about some real-life applications of HIV, how it shows the evolutionary pattern of organisms. So we know that HIV, its main goal is to replicate itself and to reproduce. But as we saw in the video, because it is a virus, it requires other cells or other living organisms in order to actually reproduce. So HIV is dependent on these cells to reproduce and replicate its genetic information. HIV, as we know, is a very prevalent disease and it's a very deadly disease. Scientists today have been trying to understand how to block HIV from replicating itself, even more so from person to person within a population. One of the main tactics used by scientists is to prevent the effects of the three main enzymes that HIV uses to replicate itself. These enzymes are reverse transcriptase, integrase, and protease, which we didn't cover in the video for time reasons. But scientists ultimately look to stop these tools by creating drugs that block their specific functions. So reverse transcriptase, we talked about in the video, how it takes the RNA genetic information from the virus and translate it into DNA. So scientists will try and find a drug, for example, that will prevent this transcription from happening by blocking an active site in the enzyme or by creating any type of inhibition for the enzyme. But what we see is that because HIV replicates so quickly, it's very difficult for one of these tactics to stop all the different forms of mutations of HIV that come about. But what we do notice is that there are people with a Delta 32 deletion. This Delta 32 deletion prevents individuals from having a co-receptor show up on the membrane of their CD4 cells. Remember how early in the video we talked about HIV requires both the CD4 cell and a co-receptor to actually bind to the cell. So that means with no co-receptor, there is no binding to the immune cell to begin with. So individuals with this Delta 32 gene are actually immune to HIV. So these have a few implications. When you think about the nature of evolution, organisms look to pass their genetic information from organism to offspring or from parent to offspring. But when this process is completely blocked, as we see with HIV and this lack of a CR receptor, there's no ability to pass this genetic information on. So this has actually been one of the most effective mutations of people who are now resistant to HIV. Keep in mind, the goal of evolution is to pass information, genetic information from parent to offspring, and for that information to adapt to its environment. But HIV is completely ineffective when the reproduction is cut off because it's not able to attach itself to the cell to begin with. Blocking the RNA from reproduction, blocking the HIV from reproducing at all, completely contrasts with its ability to adjust to its environment. Meaning that when HIV is actively reproducing, it's very adjustable, it's very fit in its environment. But when we stop HIV from even beginning reproduction by blocking it from attaching to the host cell, the complete opposite is seen to be true. So the main goal of evolution is to pass information from parent to offspring, and for that information to adapt and change over time to match its environment. These show the evolutionary implications of HIV. Thank you for watching my video on HIV and evolution.